Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door NetAdmin. DHCP. We've talked about it before, and any network admin worth their salt knows DHCP is how we often dynamically assign IP addresses to clients on a network. Pretty standard stuff. In the Linux world specifically, the big granddaddy of DHCP has always been ISC DHCP. And that would be this guy here. The Internet Systems Consortium DHCP server. It is the big one. It has been around for nearly 30 years, I think. I certainly learned it about 18 years ago when I was in university, and it hasn't substantially changed in a long time. But ISC DHCP is, as you can see here, it has no more maintenance. It's going away. Most of my work is often done in the Windows side of things, and certainly Windows has its own DHCP server, but Linux is still very, very useful for non-Windows networks. It's what I use at home, and I've found that actually going through the configuration in the Linux style where you're manually writing all of the configuration in text can be very, very, very useful for learning the protocol and learning how everything works. Certainly a little more useful than Windows, where you're kind of handheld through the GUI the whole way. That could just be my opinion on it. But like I said, ISC DHCP, the big granddaddy of them all, has been deprecated as of early 2022. You can kind of see it here, but there is a new tool available, and it's called Kia. You can think of it as IKEA without the I. You can also think of it as the flightless parrot from New Zealand if you want, which is also Kia. So yeah, it's just a new server. It's mostly feature complete at this point. They're still, expanding it over time. ISC DHCP had, like I said, almost 30 years, as far as I understand, of time that it kind of grew and morphed a little bit over time. So I expect that Kia will do the same thing. But how do we do this migration from one to the other? Do we just have to completely write it in a brand new syntax? Do we have to learn it from the ground up? Can we just take the old configuration file and drop it in? No to all of those. A partial yes to do we have to learn something new? Yes, we have to learn something new. But the migration process to migrate from ISC DHCP to ISC Kia, they have a migration assistant tool. And that's what I'm going to show you today. So the tool, first of all, I will say ISC DHCP has lots of resources available for helping to plan your migration. They have recommended steps for a successful migration. You'll notice there's 13, and then the 14th is rinse and repeat with other network segments. That can sound really intimidating. As it happens, I just had to, kind of jump into it and start figuring things out. And I think it can be shorter than that. I think. So before we continue with the migration tool, let's take a look at a DHCPD configuration file from ISC DHCP. If you'll notice, the name of the software is ISC DHCP, but you'll also see it referred to as DHCPD. The extra D on the end is just daemon. It indicates that it's the server component of the program. So in this case, I did not have dynamic DNS set up, never personally had a use for it. You certainly can, and it can be useful. It's just not what I had. Authoritative, it's an authoritative DHCP server. It was logging to local 7, which is the network news subsystem in syslog, as I recall. Had a couple of subnets set up here. This was my internal subnet. You can see I also had TFTP booting set up, though I haven't used it in years. So that's legacy configuration. That's what we call that. I also had a separate subnet set up specifically for my wireless guest network, so that anybody who wants to visit could hop onto the visitors network, and that would be more open than my internal network. I also had some DHCP reservations set up, pretty basic, all things considered, not a lot to it. So this is the configuration that I'm going to show you how we can migrate that to Kia. So the Kia Migration Assistant tool, Kia MA, although my temptation is to call it Kia-ma, sure, it is a tool that you can use online. You can install it if you've got a particularly complicated setup and the tool doesn't allow you to upload a configuration file that big. But mine is relatively small because it's just for a home network setup, and it'll work fine if we do that online. So this is it right here. Kia-ma Online. Cool. Upload your DHCP configuration. And then it'll be migrate now. Cool. A couple things I will point out really quickly though. You might think, oh my God, this is online. It's going to be kept, it's going to be scanned. Is this a big security issue? Yes and no. I don't think it's a big security issue. MAC addresses aren't supposed to be secret. If you feel that it is a concern, this is also why you can download the software and run it locally to convert your files rather than using an online tool. But if you want to use the online tool, it is HTTPS, it is secure. There's an option here to share your configuration file. And they're very upfront that this is, to use the information to improve the migration software, but your data will not be anonymized before sharing. They're very upfront about that. If you consider anything in your configuration to be sensitive, please anonymize it before sharing with ISC. So whether that is changing subnet definitions or changing host names or putting in temporary fake MAC addresses for your host reservations, whatever you want to do, those options are there. This particular configuration file, I'm going to choose dhcpd.conf. There it is. It's not very big. It's not even a kilobyte. It is IPv4. I'm not going to share it. And it also notes here, uploaded files are permanently removed from the server after 10 minutes, unless you explicitly allow your configuration to be shared. That's the only lifetime there is, so let's hit migrate. Haha, bad request. I opened this website before I started recording, so the CSRF token expired, but that'll work now. There we go. We've uploaded it. Still IPv4, not being shared. Migrate. Boom! There it is. That's what we want to see. Your config was successfully migrated. Thank you for using ISC software. So you can download your configuration file. It will be erased in 10 minutes and will not be available for download after that. That's the amount of time that you have for retrieving your configuration. And after that, they forget about it. And hopefully you've already captured it so that you don't forget about it. But the contents of the file are also shown here below, which is basically what I'm going to just copy and paste out of that so that we can examine it at our leisure. There's the output of Kia-ma, but we'll start by just looking at the actual configuration. Oh, I see what it did here. It copied all the text on the page. That's not what I wanted. Let's just copy what's in this configuration box. There'll be a lot less that I have to futz with after that. There we go. But yes, the output of Kia-ma was it read it in, okay. It converted this subnet, it converted that subnet, it converted the hosts, cool. Did not throw any major errors. Major errors, I should say. These errors are just the notifications. These are the debug messages, really. The notifications that it started parsing new subnets and new host declarations. And that's about it. So in our converted Kia configuration, you'll notice it's certainly larger. It is larger. It's a little more chonky, shall we say, to go through and actually configure all the bits and pieces. Anything that was commented in our original file is going to be copied over. And the first time I did this configuration, conversion, migration, one of those verbs is correct. The first time I did the migration, I had a whole lot of comments in my old DHCP configuration file. I've stripped those out mostly for the sake of readability, but you can still see any comments that you had previously are just copied over as they are. You can delete them. We don't need them anymore. First thing right off the bat, this configuration declares some subnets but has no interfaces config. Reference Kia number 245. What the heck is that? Well, Kia 245 is actually an issue in their GitLab. So it's referencing this unique issue. And you'll probably see this anytime you run a configuration in Kia, because ISC DHCP, when you run it, you specify interfaces on the command line. So you can end with a configuration without interfaces. If you do not have an interfaces configuration, Kia will not actually start offering DHCP service. You have to specify the interfaces you want it to run on. You can use a wildcard. You don't have to. You can specify multiple interfaces. Again, you don't have to. But this is the issue that is being referenced when it says it declares some subnets but has no interfaces config. So that's a warning. It's going to tell you exactly what you should be looking at and why. No DHCP dynamic DNS updates. We had it set to none. The equivalent is false. Authoritative, true. That is supported. Log facility of local 7. Log facility is not supported. Please use the Kia logger destination environment variable instead. What's that about? Well, what's that about? I'll come back to that. Let's continue on through the rest of it before we circle around back to these errors that have been noted. Subnet 4, ID number 1. Here's a subnet. Here's the pool declaration. Cool. Here's the option data. Domain name servers, domain name, routers, broadcast address, valid lifetime, max valid lifetime, next server. Okay, cool. All of this is cool. But it looks like we're missing something. Didn't I also have a file name to do this TFTP boot? Well, we don't see it there. Let's keep going, and we'll make a mental note to come back to that as well, okay? ID number 2, this is my visitors subnet. Okay, here's the subnet, here's the pools, option data, domain name servers. I don't assign them my internal domain name because it's my visitors subnet. Okay. Routers, broadcast address, valid lifetime, max valid lifetime. Oh, boot file name was defined in an unsupported scope. What's that about? Again, it's warned us something. It's attempted to make the conversion, but something about it thinks was unsupported. Not 100% sure what that's about. Let's make a note to come back to it and keep on going. Host reservation identifiers, hardware address. Okay. Reservation mode global. Okay. Don't know what those are. Reservations. This is our new format. Host name, hardware address, IP address, and it's got all 4 of them right here. Now, the big thing you'll note about that is that while we just had these blocks declared previously, and it was, pretty short, look at the size of the scroll bar. When you get to the new one, the scroll bar is a lot smaller and there's a lot more to have to scroll through. If you understand modern web coding, you'll notice that this is JSON. This is JavaScript Object Notation. Pretty sure that's what JSON stands for. And there's, yeah, the three things that we noticed. Boot file name was defined in an unsupported scope. We don't have any interfaces config. We don't have any log facility. What do we do about this? We have to dig in and do a little bit of research is what we have to do. At this point, I'm going to cheat just a little bit. Instead of walking you through every step of the way to dig into the documentation, which honestly you could and should do, Kiyama as it works, if you scrolled all the way to the bottom, what are the limitations? What are the next steps? Please find out here. If you go to the please find out here, it gives you more information. It gives you information on limitations. It says there's an experimental project to translate lease files, Kiyama leases. It didn't work. It didn't work for me whatsoever. It works on the samples. It didn't work on my leases file whatsoever. I tried several times. It just, nah, and I don't know why. So you may not be able to convert your leases, but your next steps for this should be found in the Kia Administrator Reference Manual. It's a big thing. It's a big thing. Database administration, configuration. You might look at configuration first, but I wouldn't recommend it. Control agent, database connectivity. Most of what I'm actually going to want to look at is under section 8, the DHCP version 4 server, because that's what I'm running. A lot of it will be server configuration, host reservations, etc. And there's a lot of detail here. A lot of detail. But again, rather than going through all of it, I'm going to show you what I ended up with. But what I ended up with might not be suitable for you. So take it as a starting point by all means. Don't take it as the final word. The other section I referenced quite a bit was 19, logging. Because one of the first things, not the actual first thing, but one of the first things I looked at was this whole log facility is not supported. Okay. So what do I do about that? I want, the logging configuration to be one of the first things that it loads so that it outputs to the right location if I need to do troubleshooting. Well, as it turns out, it has to read the configuration file first in order to get the logging configuration. But if there was an error reading in the configuration file, where does it log? That's what the Kia logger destination environment variable is all about. It's preset by default if you've installed it via a package. So I'm going to take one other detour, come out of this, and say, using official ISC packages for Kia. If you were to install from your distribution's package management, you might get Kia 2.4, you might get Kia 2.6. I don't know which. At this point, to the best of my knowledge, Canonical, who runs Ubuntu, still has Kia 2.4 in the repositories for the latest LTS, which was 2404. However, since then, Kia 2.6 has been released, and this, massive administration manual, this one, if you look at it, this is actually for 2.7.4-Git, the under development version that isn't even released. So that may not be what you actually want to review. In that case, I would go to kia.readthedocs.io. 261 by default is what we should be looking for, because this will have the commands that are available in 261. This is how we go and find the correct version. I knew it was somewhere on here, I just couldn't find it, but there it is. So latest, or any of the older versions or newer versions. Just make sure you use the reference manual for the version that you're going to install. If you want to install something that is up to date directly from ISC, then you can use the official ISC packages for Kia. They have several of them, as you can see here. If you just install ISC-Kia, you get everything. You get control sockets, dynamic DNS, DHCP version 4, DHCP version 6, hooks, common, admin, whole pile of stuff. You don't need all of it. If I'm being perfectly honest, the only thing I installed was the DHCP4 server. I also installed some additional documentation so that I have that as a reference. I didn't do anything else. I don't need anything else. They have commercially licensed stuff as well. Okay, fine. But to set up the repository on Debian and Ubuntu, you can just run this command and it will do the necessary for you. Am I suggesting you trust a random script you find on the internet, no matter where it's from? No, I'm not. I downloaded this first, quite honestly, and I read through all of the code to be sure of what it was doing before I blindly trusted it. So I have a pretty good idea of what it is and what it does. In this case, it adds the ISC repositories, auto-detects your version of Debian or Ubuntu, adds the correct repository, makes sure you have the prerequisites, which is stuff like apt transport HTTPS, GNU PG, etc. So it does all the necessary and sets up the repository, and you're good to go. Once you install ISC Kia DHCP4 server, your Kia logger destination environment variable is set up in the unit file that comes pre-packaged for systemd. So they've already got that there. But if you want to set up logging after the configuration file has loaded, you might end up with something like this. I have a loggers section here. I still have some of these comments because I'm going to be reading this later. The name, this is the name of the daemon that is going to be logged. This is the name it's going to log everything under. Specifies the output file. You can log to standard out. You can log to standard error. I'm going to log to syslog just because that seems to make sense to me. It has a default pattern. As it says, this is suitable for use with systemd. Fine. That's what my syslog is. It's running under systemd, so fine. Flush is set to false, but it's commented out by default, same as the max sizes, same as the maximum number of rotated files to keep. We're going to syslog. Syslog will handle that for us. I'm logging at the default level of info, which again is a default. You can change this to whatever you want to do. Debug level, like it says, be cautious. It can generate, a lot of logs if you tell it to do so. So be careful with that. Control socket. This is something that isn't in the one that Kia generated for us. What is this? In this case, this is something that came from the default configuration file that Kia installed when I installed the server. And I didn't actually install the control socket server, did I? But if I want to do it in future, I probably want to be able to just install it and have it hook up in the default fashion. So I've included that here for future experimentation and compatibility, you can say. It'll work perfectly fine if you omit it. Interfaces config. This is the thing that Kia was warning about, where we don't have any interfaces configuration, and it referenced the issue on GitLab. Okay. In this case, I know the interface I want it to run on. This will cause it to actually listen to this interface to process DHCP inbound. DHCP socket type is raw. You've got two choices here, raw and UDP. Raw will handle the local subnet and any incoming relay through a DHCP relay agent. UDP will only handle relay traffic. So if you're setting this up on a local subnet, it's very important that you have DHCP socket type raw. That's the only way it's going to work. But on the other hand, if you have a central server that's not handling the local subnet and it's only handling relay traffic, UDP might be suitable. Your mileage may vary. Lease database, another thing that was not listed in our KIAMA configuration whatsoever. What is this? The lease database is how it actually keeps track of the leases that it issues. There's a few different choices. Memfile is the first one. It keeps it in memory. And if persist is true, it writes it out to a file every so often, which is a good way of having a backup. If the server shuts down, it can reread the leases when it's done. Persist true is highly recommended. Other choices, you could add additional configuration to have the configuration and the leases written to MySQL. You can also have it write to Postgres. It requires additional configuration. I'm not using it. This is just for a basic home network. So Memfile is perfectly good for me. DHCP DNS, dynamic DNS, still enabled false. It's not something I've set up. Authoritative, I've added calculate T times. This has to do with the timers for T1 and T2, the renew timer and the rebind timer. By default, it's not in here, but by default, Kia specifies a renew timer and a rebind timer, and it does so at the global level. If it's specified at the global level, then it takes effect for everything, no matter what the max lifetime is for individual subnets. And in this case, for example, my internal subnet has a valid lifetime, and my visitor subnet has a much shorter valid lifetime. So I pulled out the renew timer and rebind timer, and I'm telling it to calculate the T times as they should be. So that T1 will fire for renewing the lease at 50% of the lease lifetime, and the rebind timer, T2, will fire at 0.85%, 85% of the lease lifetime, 0.85. Reservations in subnet, reservations out of pool. What are these? Didn't we have reservations global? That's what we had here, reservation mode global. First of all, reservation mode global, reservation mode doesn't exist anymore in Kia 2.6, even though it's put in there by Kia Migration Assistant. It's not actually a thing. Global means that it will parse all of the reservations on the global level, and it's to be used for clients that need to have the same configuration no matter what subnet they're on. But I need them to have the correct subnet. If one of my reserved hosts goes to the visitor's subnet, let's just say for the sake of argument, it goes to the visitor's subnet, if it still gets an IP address for my internal network, that's not going to work, because that VLAN is not listening for those addresses. So that's not going to be useful. So in this case, instead of reservations global, I've switched it to reservations in subnet, true. If you do that, it has to parse every time it does a lease. It has to make sure that it's not handing out a lease to another station unless it's the one that's required. But in this case, I know that my pool starts from 105 up to 254. All of my reservations are under that. So in that case, I can also set reservations out of pool and tell it anything that you assign out of the pool doesn't have to be checked for reservations because the administrator is already making sure that they're separate. Cool. Option data, domain name servers. At the global level here, this is just going to be a default that is set for everything. Now I have my subnet declaration for my internal subnet. I've added TFTP server name, pointing to a TFTP server that I'm going to use. I've added boot file name and put the data in there. It's important to note that you only need the name or the code. You don't need both. But I'm a network admin. it helps me to double check my code to make sure that I can see the actual DHCP option as well as the official name. So that's why I have that. I have next server set here. Next server is not actually code 66. Code 66 is the TFTP server name. I had next server set up previously, but it turns out that's not the actual option for DHCP 66, which is why I've changed it. But then there are some implementations that are specifically looking for next server, which is the DHCP option SI adder, server IP address. So I have it here. It's commented out, but it's there in case I have some really old client that won't work without it. I can just uncomment it and go to work. Reservations, because these are subnet specific, I have them within the subnet. And then I can move on to my visitors subnet, and I can say I'm also having the option for routers and broadcast address, but I don't need any of these reservations. I don't need additional domain name. I don't need TFTP boot stuff. That's not required. So that's what I ended up with. How long did it take me to, write this and assemble everything? Probably took me a couple of hours. Hopefully, it will not take you a couple of hours because you've got something else to go off of now. So that is what I ended up with for Kia. The migration assistant was a good start. Was not the end point of the journey. But it's a much larger configuration than ISC DHCP was. But after 30 years, you have to learn something new. Upgrades come. So, yeah, but that's the thing that it is. Hopefully that was useful to you. If you have other thoughts on things that you would like to see, feel free to let me know down in the comments. Until then, I am your next door NetAdmin, and we'll see you next time.